Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. On this program, we've examined many different aspects of the Civil War, and as we continue to go ahead and look at this particular time period in American history, it's oftentimes interesting to note that we always know the big names, we always know the big battles. We seem to remember all the big things because, well, they're always repeated to us. But sometimes there are important events that occur within a certain time period which are left to the wayside. It's not because they weren't important, quite contrary, they were exceptionally important. Probably the main reason why is because there aren't many people who actually look for these particular events. One such topic, which recently has been gaining a great deal of traction, has been that of African Americans and their role during the Civil War itself. In order to help shed more light on this particular topic, joining us today is Mr. Jimmy Price, who is the site manager of both the Bristow Battlefield in Bristow, Virginia, and the Ben Lomond site in Prince William County. Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're looking forward to learning a great deal about this. And so, most folks might not know the first thing about Ben Lomond or Bristow Battlefield, or probably even where Bristow is. And so if you could take a moment just to let us know a little bit about where and what those are.
Okay. Well, Ben Lomond Historic Site is located near the Manassas Battlefield. It's located off of Sudley Manor Drive. It's a manor house that goes back to 1832. The ground actually goes back to the famous Carter family of Virginia. The house is built by a guy named Benjamin Tasker Chin. So if you've ever been to Manassas Battlefield, Chin Ridge is a very important feature. That's actually named after the gentleman who built the house. The way we have the house set up right now is as a Civil War hospital. So if you go to the battlefield and learn about what happened on Henry House Hill and you're interested in learning what happened to those men who were wounded, come to Ben Lomond and we pick up the story of the wounded soldiers and the ordeal that they went through. Bristow Station Battlefield has actually two battles that were fought on the park. In 1862, the Battle of Kettle Run, right before Second Manassas, and then the Battle of Bristow Station proper in October of 1863, a very resounding Confederate defeat in that sort of netherworld that happened between Gettysburg and when the Overland Campaign kicked off in 1864.
Well, that's interesting. And so now, one of the things that's rather unique is that in dealing with the Civil War, one of the topics that you have certainly championed and are deeply vested in is the issue of African Americans in the Civil War. And so what made you so interested in this particular topic?
Well, I kind of came to the subject sort of, from the side. I had always been interested in the Civil War. I started as a Civil War reenactor, I must confess. I'm in a recovery program. But in the 1990s, I did become a Civil War reenactor. I was a Confederate right around the time the movie Gettysburg came out. And at that time, there was a lot of, rah-rah military history. You learned, what happened at Gettysburg. I never really quite encountered the African-American story until later on in the 2000s, particularly when I was working around Richmond. I learned about a battle called New Market Heights where 14 African-American soldiers won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and thought, wow, I can't believe nobody's talked about that before. So that sort of led to my research on what were called United States Colored Troops, African-American Union soldiers, and also the newly freed slaves and their sort of ordeal and their path to freedom.
Now, you mentioned New Market Heights, and that was the first book you've written in this particular subject. And so most folks probably don't know many of the smaller battles, especially around the Siege of Richmond, and there's also the New Market in the Shenandoah Valley. And so perhaps a little background understanding of what this battle is.
Okay. It takes place in September of 1864. It's part of a larger battle called the Battle of Chaffin's Farm. So if you've ever been sort of east of Richmond to the National Park site at Fort Harrison, that's part of that larger battle. But New Market Heights is unique in that it was a battle that was sort of catered for the United States Colored Troops. It's the Army of the James under the command of Benjamin Franklin Butler, very famous and infamous, if you will, gentleman from the Civil War era, a political general who was displeased at the way that African American troops were treated in the aftermath of the Battle of the Crater. Probably the most famous instance of black troops being involved in combat in the East up to that time. So he sort of wanted to redeem their reputation. His attack against Richmond in the fall of 1864 involved two prongs, and one of those prongs was against New Market Heights, and he put all of his black soldiers in the front lines. He wanted to make sure that they were the tip of the spear, and that if they won the day, that their reputation would be redeemed. And as events turned out, they did take the line at great cost, and there were 14 of the soldiers in that battle who won the Medal of Honor.
Now, receiving the Congressional Medal of Honor is exceptionally hard. What would be the criterion to first get it to begin with? And then, while I know that with 14 people, that's a lot, are there any exceptional ones who specifically, through their actions, met the criterion for the Medal of Honor?
Well, that's actually a matter of a little bit of controversy. The Medal of Honor was created during the American Civil War in 1862, and it did not have sort of the gravitas that it has now when it was first created. You know, I joke that in order to get the Medal of Honor now, you have to die twice in combat. Back then, you could get the Medal of Honor for various things. There was a regiment that received the Medal of Honor en masse for re-enlisting in 1863. Everybody that was part of President Lincoln's funeral escort won the Medal of Honor, or were given the Medal of Honor. There was actually a committee established after the war to sort of sift through and weed out sort of the invalid Medals of Honor and revoke those. But for the 14 African Americans who won the Medal of Honor at New Market Heights, none of those medals were revoked. They all won the Medal of Honor for things like taking over command of their units when all the white officers were killed. African American units back then had to be commanded by white officers, and officers led from the front back then, so the white officers went down en masse in this attack. So it's a lot of the African American NCOs sort of taking over, rallying their men, rescuing the colors, the regimental colors, which was a very big deal. So that's mainly what they win the Medal of Honor for. Some Medal of Honor recipients that stand out, Christian Fleetwood, probably the most famous African American to win the Medal of Honor in that one battle. A gentleman that I like to talk about is named Powhatan Beatty. He actually was born a slave near Richmond, oddly enough. He got his freedom, escaped north to Ohio, joined an Ohio black regiment, and in September of 1864 found himself back in Richmond, going up against possibly some men who may have known his former master. So he takes over a company in the 5th U.S. Colored Troops, wins the Medal of Honor, and then has an illustrious career after the war as a black Shakespearean actor. So can't make that up.
Wow. So talk about notoriety continuing forward from that field. And so, the U.S. Colored Troops win at New Market Heights, and then what happened to those men after the battle? Because obviously their career just is like, oh, good job, we won a battle, off you go. It's not like that.
Yeah, they won their phase of the battle. The overall Battle of Chaffin's Farm, it kind of bogs down. There's some higher-ranking officers in the Union Army that get wounded. The subordinates that take over don't really understand the battle plan too well, and they sort of flounder, right outside of Richmond. It's the most successful effort by the Union Army north of the James River to that point, but they sort of, there's a stalemate that settles in. They entrench. There'll be more fighting north of the James, but really they don't move out of those lines until April of 1865 when Richmond is evacuated. Those are some of the first troops that go into Richmond after it falls.
Okay, so once the battle's over, they're just stuck, and then they basically create that giant national park of fortifications that we all see today as a result, just because they were stuck there for so long. Now, because the Civil War has so many different topics, you found yourself delving into another book in regards to the Civil War, which is the First Battle of Deep Bottom, Grant versus Lee on the James. Now, what is the Battle of Deep Bottom?
That's a great question. That's what I was trying to answer in that book, because that's a question I would get a lot. It actually is a battle that takes place on pretty much the same ground as the Battle of New Market Heights. New Market Heights is the third attempt, by the Union Army to try to gain a foothold north of the James River and east of the city of Richmond. They launch attacks from a bridgehead that's established at a place called Deep Bottom, because the bottom of the river was deep there. That's how they came up with names back then. So this one goes back to July of 1864. Earlier I had mentioned the Battle of the Crater. That's an effort at Petersburg to try to break the stalemate there during the siege of Petersburg. First Deep Bottom is actually a part of that operation. What they do is they launch a foray from the Deep Bottom bridgehead, sort of as a distraction to the main effort that's going to be taking place down at the crater. So they send 2 corps of infantry and 1 division of cavalry, hopefully to cut some railroad lines, possibly even threaten the city of Richmond itself. But in actuality, things kind of bogged down. There's a very famous Union general who's in command named Winfield Scott Hancock. Him and Phil Sheridan are the 2 commanding officers for the Union, and they kind of fumbled the ball. And it serves well for siphoning off troops from the main rebel army at Petersburg, but other than that, they don't really accomplish much.
Now, when you say they fumble the ball, do they just kind of hold up their battle plan and somebody on the other side with a good telescope could read it, or how would you describe fumbling the ball in a battle like this?
Well, they greatly outnumbered the Confederate soldiers that were in the area, but on the morning of the first day of the battle, they launched an attack against New Market Heights, partly, and they run into stiffer resistance than they had anticipated, and they ran into soldiers that were from Lee's army in Northern Virginia. They kind of thought they were going to run up against sort of rear echelon types, the clerks from the War Department in Richmond. So they got a bit of a bloody nose early on at a fight called Tillman's Gate, and after that, Hancock, who, as you know, was wounded at Gettysburg, he's suffering greatly from his Gettysburg wound. They had just gone through the Overland Campaign and the initial attempts to take Petersburg, suffering grievous casualties. And I think they balked. They could have easily sort of steamrolled the rebel soldiers there, but instead, I think...
The element of surprise.
Sort of a psychological trauma there.
Now, once Deep Bottom, the battle had been finished, Grant and Lee, they continue their slugfest, and it's kind of like almost a prequel to the New Market Heights battle that you have. And so in researching these specific moments during a siege like the one on Richmond, what would you say is something that you would take away from looking at these? You have 2 specific battles that you've looked at here. What do you kind of take away from that and looking at it? Is there something? Because sometimes when you study something and you learn about it and you basically look at it from every angle, there's still more questions that walk away. What do you kind of take away from these 2 battles combined?
I take away that there's still a lot of uncharted territory for research. Fighting north of the James River in what's now sort of eastern Henrico County, there's a lot of fighting that takes place there. In 1862, people are more familiar with that, the 7 Days Campaign. There's a lot of fighting that takes place at First Deep Bottom. Obviously, if you have a first, you have a second. So there's Second Deep Bottom, New Market Heights, fighting that lasts all the way until late October of 1864. And there's over 4 generals that are killed in this fighting. So it's an interesting opportunity to sort of delve into stuff that hasn't really seen the light of day, rather than rehashing the Battle of Gettysburg for the umpteenth time. There's a lot of interesting fighting that still hasn't been written about.
This is true. Now, one topic which was brought to my attention that you have a great deal of knowledge on is something called the Arlington's Freedmen's Village. And so, just basing off the title alone, I could put out the educated guess, it's a small community of freedmen that is in present-day Arlington County.
Yes, it's actually within the confines of what's now Arlington National Cemetery.
Okay. And so what exactly was this then? I mean, because just based off the title, you can kind of piece it together, but that's kind of the fleeting passing glance thing that a lot of textbooks might give, if they're not going to really delve into it. So what was the Freedmen's Village in Arlington?
Well, Freedmen's Village was what we would call a contraband camp. So it's a place for newly freed slaves to come and sort of transition from slavery to freedom. And there are many contraband camps that spring up around Washington, D.C. In April of 1862, when D.C. Emancipates all their slaves. Immediately people that are just across the river in Virginia are going to flock to D.C. and gain their freedom. And so there's many contraband camps springing up in D.C. as early as April of 1862. They quickly become overcrowded and disease-ridden. And there's some camps that are averaging around 25 deaths a day in late 1862. So as a recourse to that, the federal government, which has by this point reclaimed the Custis Lee estate at Arlington, and they sort of step in and they dedicate some of the former Custis ground to what's called Freeman's Village. There's a church there, there's schools, there's about 50 homes, and this is really a place where they were envisioning people that were coming out of slavery, a place where they could come, gain a skill, and then leave and hopefully get gainful employment somewhere else. And it's in operation until 1900.
Well, wow. Now, considering the fact that slavery itself ended 1865, 66, 67, depending on where in the country you were, and then with the passage of the 13th Amendment, why is it that it remained in operation until the turn of the century?
Well, the reason is that these people, first of all, they didn't really have anywhere else to go immediately, and there was sort of a miscommunication between sort of the government that's running it. They're envisioning this as a place where the freedmen are going to come in, learn a skill, learn a trade, and then leave. What actually happens is they come in and they establish homes, communities. There's remnants of the communities that were established that are still there, and they view that place as home. So really, they have to be evicted by the War Department and eventually by Congress. And the last of them leave in 1900.
Wow. Now, you said there's still remnants of the buildings there. Now, where specifically are these remnants?
Well, they're not remnants of the building.
Okay.
The buildings themselves are now different sections of Arlington Cemetery.
So
the eastern reaches of Arlington Cemetery that stretch down towards the Pentagon. That was all Freedmen's Village.
Okay, so they're somewhat occupied
Yes.
by folks who are permanently residing there now. So now, in all the times I've been to Arlington Cemetery, for the life of me, I don't recall ever seeing anything about this.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, does Arlington National Cemetery even acknowledge this, the Freedmen's Village, on
Yes.
their site? Okay.
They do. The National Park Service, which operates Arlington House, there's sort of an island at the top of the cemetery there with the house. They have a small exhibit that gives you the history of Freedmen's Village, and the cemetery is getting a lot more proactive about promoting the history as well. You may be familiar with the Navy Annex that was recently demolished just right outside of the cemetery near the Air Force Memorial. There's talk of them actually putting in a Black Heritage Museum that will discuss Freedmen's Village in detail there, so let's hope that happens.
So now, when it comes to the Freedmen's Village, if lots of people are coming in, did anyone who would later go on to become very famous, or at least rather notable, go through there? I mean, we hear stories like Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, from post-Civil War, how their rise comes up. But those are just notable names that some folks might know off the top of their heads. Did anyone notable come out of the Freedmen's Village in Arlington?
Yeah, the village is dedicated in late December of 1863. And since it's just across the river from Washington, D.C., just about all of Lincoln's cabinet was there. a lot of prominent visitors. That it was just irresistible, the fact that this was Robert E. Lee's former home, and now you have newly freed slaves working the ground as on farms and gaining wages. That was just too good for a lot of people. So it was definitely prominent in the press, and people like Sojourner Truth. She spent a lot of time in Freemans Village helping teach the newly freed slaves, or former enslaved, I should say. Harriet Jacobs, author of a very famous slave narrative called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. After she gets her freedom, she's a teacher in Freemans Village. So there are people like that. Sojourner Truth definitely left her mark. There was an incident where some slave owners from Maryland being a slave state that's still in the United States, where slavery is still legal, they came to collect their former slaves, and small little Sojourner Truth went out there and confronted them, and her famous quote was that if they took them away, that she would make the United States rock like a cradle. And they did go away without their slaves, so she was a feisty lady.
Well, that's definitely got a lot of passion, fire in you if you can go ahead and do that, especially at that time. Now, one of the things that you've also gone ahead and spearheaded in passing on historical information is through the World Wide Web and a blog, which you currently author. And so it was formerly known as Sable Arm, but now it goes under a new title. So if we wanted to Google it, what do we look for?
Freedom by the Sword would be the title. It was formerly called the Sable Arm because I was exclusively blogging about United States colored troops. Now I've sort of expanded the scope of my research and writing on there to include things like Freemans Village and Deep Bottom, so I figured I needed a new title, so I just kind of gave it the generic Freedom by the Sword.
Now, since the blog is dedicated to the African American experience in the Civil War, how long has it been operational, both in its current and former name?
Since 2009.
Oh, so a great deal of content then has been put in. And how do you feel when it comes to imparting knowledge through a blog format? Do you find that it's much easier to connect with audiences, or is there a challenge to it? I mean, how do you feel in that regards with new media?
I think it depends on what I'm writing about. I've had posts that I've written that I thought were terribly interesting for me that nobody seemed to care one way or the other about, and so a lot of bloggers will not necessarily realize the impact that their writing is having. They'll just put their information out there in the ether, and unbeknownst to them, people are reading it, but a lot of people don't take the time to comment. So if anybody's watching this, please comment on blogs that you like. It's very encouraging for the authors. But I have had instances where I've sort of felt better about things. I've had descendants of people who fought at Deep Bottom or at New Market Heights reach out to me. Some of the Medal of Honor recipients, I've gotten in touch with their families through the blog. So it is, I think, a very effective medium, and it allows you a lot of flexibility as a writer. You don't necessarily have to write a pristine footnoted monograph. You can just write a little snippet on something that you think to be interesting.
And so, in looking at this from a historical point of view, we always look for ways in which to, do research and discover more. Why do you think, for any of the younger audience members out there, it's important for them to actually go beyond just what is easily accessible in understanding and learning history? Why do you think the elbow deep research is important?
Because you always find stories out there that or sources. One of the stories that I wrote about on my blog, if you've ever seen the film Lincoln, one of the characters in that is Elizabeth Keckley. She briefly mentions that she has a son who died during the Civil War in that movie. And I had never heard of that. I knew of Keckley. She actually was at Arlington making dresses for Mrs. Lee before the war. So I dug into it, found his service record, and if you go to my blog, you can find, to my knowledge, the only sort of in-depth treatment of his name was George Kirkland, and he got killed early in the war in 1861 at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. His father was his owner, and his mother, of course, was Elizabeth Keckley. So sometimes it doesn't take much digging, but there is plenty of stuff out there that remains to be seen, even with the subject that we agonize over, like the Civil War.
Well, Jimmy, thank you so very much for coming and shedding a whole new light on this particular topic. And on behalf of us here at Virginia Time Travel, we want to go ahead and give you a little bit more insight for the Civil War. Nice little book, Alexandria 1861 to 65,
Cool.
Pictorial history of the city, and who knows, maybe it'll lead you on your next adventure for future projects. And so when we look at African Americans in the Civil War, it isn't just simply isolated down to just a couple events that we all know of. Things like Glory, 12 Years a Slave. These are both films which have certainly inspired many people to learn more about history itself. To learn more about African American history and their involvement in the American Civil War, please visit our website, www.timetravel21.com. And if you have any questions regarding this topic, or if you would like to go ahead and be able to get in touch with Jay Price, please feel free to email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. This has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Hoping that after today's episode, maybe research doesn't look so scary after all.